Stop right there. What are you doing in this apartment?
This is my home.
Yeah? Prove it. Show me your ID. Now.
You don't have the authority to do this.
Don't argue with me. Turn around. Hands where I can see them.
Listen carefully. My name is Judge Carana.
The words hung in the cold night air, sharp and authoritative, spoken as if compliance were already guaranteed. Snowflakes drifted slowly under the glow of porch lights, settling quietly on the pavement of an otherwise peaceful suburban street. Holiday decorations shimmered from nearby houses, soft music leaking faintly through closed windows. It was the kind of night meant for warmth, privacy, and calm. But for one federal judge, standing inside her own apartment doorway, this night was about to turn into something far darker. Earlier that evening, everything had been ordinary. The judge had spent the day alone, moving through familiar routines. A quiet call with family, a simple dinner, a glass of wine resting untouched on the counter as she settled into the comfort of her living room. The outside world felt distant, muted by falling snow and the sense that nothing unexpected would interrupt the night. That illusion shattered the moment the knock came. Firm, repetitive, not the sound of a neighbor, not casual, official. When she opened the door, she did so cautiously, keeping the security latch in place. Two uniformed security officers stood outside, both scanning the interior of her apartment before even speaking. Their posture wasn't neutral. It was assertive, suspicious, as if they'd already decided something was wrong. One of them gestured toward the doorframe. "Step aside. We need to check inside." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She did exactly what years on the bench had trained her to do. She asserted her rights clearly and calmly. "My name is Judge Carana. I'm recording this." The moment the phone came into view, the tone changed. "Please put the phone down and cooperate." The demand wasn't a request. It was an order. The implication was unmistakable. Compliance was expected. Resistance would not be tolerated. One officer shifted his weight closer, angling his body toward the doorway, as if preparing to enter without permission. She stayed where she was. Calm down. The irony of the word wasn't lost on her. She was calm, measured, fully aware of what was happening, and fully aware that this encounter had already crossed a line. The officers claimed they were responding to a complaint. Something vague, something unspecified. Noise, suspicious activity. They didn't say which neighbor called. They didn't provide a report number. They didn't explain why an inspection was necessary when no crime was visible, audible, or alleged with any clarity. She asked simple questions, lawful questions. Why are you here? What is the complaint? On what basis are you requesting entry? The answers were evasive, circular, dismissive. Instead of clarity, she was met with insistence. Instead of justification, pressure. They asked who else was inside. They asked what she was doing earlier. They asked for identification, standing inside her own home, having committed no crime. She declined. That refusal seemed to irritate them more than anything else. One officer's expression hardened. His voice sharpened. He stepped closer to the threshold, ignoring the physical boundary she had clearly maintained. "This could go a lot easier if you just cooperate." The message was clear. Rights were an inconvenience. Resistance was a problem. And authority, real or imagined, was on their side. She didn't argue emotionally. She didn't threaten. She stated facts. She explained that without a warrant, probable cause, or exigent circumstances, they had no legal authority to enter her apartment or demand identification. That was the moment everything shifted. The explanation didn't end the encounter. It escalated it. One officer muttered something about the neighborhood, about safety, about people being on edge lately. The implication crept in slowly, then unmistakably. She didn't fit what they expected to see there. She understood immediately. This wasn't about noise. This wasn't about safety. This was about perception. And standing in her doorway, phone recording steadily, Judge Carana realized this encounter wasn't just personal. It was evidence. The realization settled in quietly but firmly. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would resolve itself with a few calm explanations. This was something else entirely. A test of authority. A test of compliance. And, more than anything, a test of how far they could push before she pushed back. One of the officers glanced past her shoulder again, his eyes moving through the apartment as if inventorying the space. Cabinets. Hallway. Living room. His gaze lingered longer than necessary, invasive without ever crossing the threshold. We just need to make sure everything's okay inside. The words sounded reasonable on the surface. But Judge Carana knew better. She had heard this language in courtrooms countless times, phrases designed to sound benign while bypassing legal limits. She responded evenly, stating once again that she was alone, there was no disturbance, and there was no consent to enter. That answer wasn't what they wanted. The officer nearest the door shifted his stance again, now clearly blocking part of the exit. His partner remained silent, watching closely, arms stiff at his sides. Neither wrote anything down. Neither referenced a device. No notes. No report. Just presence and pressure. When she asked which neighbor had complained, they refused to say. When she asked for documentation, they deflected. When she asked why she, specifically, had drawn this response, neither gave a direct answer. Instead, one of them said something that snapped everything into focus. People around here notice things. Someone saw you earlier. They got concerned. Concerned about what? The officer didn't answer directly. He just said the description matched her. A person hanging around. A person who didn't seem familiar. A person who raised questions. Judge Carana felt the weight of the implication land heavily in her chest. The suspicious person was her. Walking to her own mailbox. Standing on her own property. Existing in a space someone else had decided she didn't belong in. She didn't raise her voice. But she made a decision. She angled the phone slightly higher, ensuring both officers were fully in frame, and clearly stated that she was recording an interaction with security officers who were demanding entry into her home without legal authority. The reaction was immediate. Put the phone down. That order came faster than anything else they'd said. One officer took a half-step forward, his hand lifting instinctively as if to reach for the device before catching himself. The other officer scanned the street, suddenly alert to the possibility of witnesses. She told them calmly that she had every right to record, that she was on her own property, that she was documenting the encounter for her own protection. They didn't like that. The officer who had been speaking most aggressively leaned in closer and lowered his voice. This is a good building. Good people live here. We keep it that way. The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was loaded with meaning, with boundaries that weren't written anywhere, but were enforced all the same. Judge Carana asked him to explain what he meant by people like that. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then he said she knew exactly what he meant. That was the moment the encounter crossed from questionable to indefensible. The pretense of procedure fell away. This was no longer about safety or complaints. It was about control, about deciding who belonged and who needed to be reminded that they were being watched. Her voice remained steady as she warned them that their statements were being recorded, that their conduct was inappropriate, that they were violating her rights. Instead of backing off, they doubled down. If you keep interfering, we can make this difficult. Interfering with what? She asked. They couldn't answer. No crime. No report. No lawful investigation. Just pressure. Then she did something neither of them expected. She identified herself fully. She stated her name, clearly and slowly. Then her position. A federal judge. Assigned to the district court. Speaking on the record. The effect wasn't relief. It was hostility. One officer scoffed. Said anyone could claim that. Said judges didn't live in places like this. The other stared at her as if she'd issued a challenge rather than a fact. Instead of retreating, they demanded proof. She refused. She told them she had no obligation to prove her identity to officers who had no legal basis for their demands. She told them this interaction was over and that they needed to leave her property immediately. For a moment, it looked like they might comply. Then they didn't. They insisted on staying. Insisted on verifying her story. Insisted they weren't going anywhere. That was when Judge Carana offered them a way out. She told them that if they left immediately, she would not pursue the matter further. No complaints. No escalation. No consequences. It was a lifeline. They ignored it. Instead, they smirked. Asked for her to go ahead and complain. Said it wouldn't matter. Said people like her always tried, and nothing ever came of it. Standing there in the doorway, phone still recording, Judge Carana understood something crucial. They believed they were untouchable, and they had no idea how wrong they were. The confidence in their voices wasn't subtle. It was the kind that only comes from experience. Experience doing this before. Experience facing no consequences. Experience knowing complaints disappear before they ever reach the right desk. Judge Carana had seen that confidence on the stand many times. She knew exactly what it meant. One of the officers asked for her identification again, this time with a sharper edge. "We're not leaving until we verify who you are." She reminded them that they were still standing at her door without consent, without cause, and without authority. She reminded them that continuing to remain on her property after being told to leave constituted trespassing. That word finally got their attention. Not enough to stop, but enough to irritate. The officer closest to her leaned forward and said they could arrest her for obstructing an investigation. When she asked what investigation that was, he had no answer. He simply repeated the threat, louder this time, as if volume could replace legality. She didn't flinch. Instead, she asked for their names and badge numbers. The response was dismissive. One officer said she could look it up later. The other laughed quietly and muttered that complaints from residents like her didn't go very far. That statement, casual, arrogant, and unguarded, was captured cleanly on the recording. It told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about one bad decision. It was a pattern, a routine, something that had worked for them before. The encounter dragged on, minute after minute, with the officers cycling through the same tactics: pressure, vague threats, half answers, and repeated demands that she comply to make things easier. Each time, she responded the same way, calmly, clearly, and on the record. She didn't argue emotionally. She didn't insult them. She simply stated facts. That restraint seemed to frustrate them more than anything else. Finally, one of the officers stepped back and pulled out his phone. He turned slightly away and made a call. His voice dropped, but not enough to be inaudible. Judge Carana could hear fragments: complaint, refusal, recording, uncooperative. When he finished the call, his expression had changed. Not relieved, annoyed. He walked back toward the doorway and told his partner they were leaving. But before they did, he looked directly at her and said something that sealed their fate. "This isn't over. We know where you live." The words were delivered flatly, without emotion, as if they were stating a simple fact rather than issuing a threat. His partner added that people who caused problems usually regretted it. That positions didn't make anyone immune. Every word was recorded. They turned and walked away, their boots crunching softly against the snow as they disappeared down the walkway. The street returned to its artificial calm, holiday lights glowing, houses silent, the night pretending nothing had happened. Judge Carana closed the door and locked it. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She didn't sit down. She didn't pour another drink. She moved with purpose. Years of legal training kicked in instantly. She wrote down everything while it was still fresh: their words, their behavior, the sequence of events. She backed up the video to multiple locations: cloud storage, email, redundancy. Then she made a decision most people in her position wouldn't. She didn't call local authorities. She bypassed them entirely. Within the hour, she contacted federal officials directly. She identified herself. She explained what had happened. She provided the recording. She emphasized the threat. The response was immediate. Agents reviewed the footage that same night. Not because of who she was, but because of what the video showed. Clear violations. Explicit statements. Conduct that couldn't be explained away. What none of the officers knew was that this wasn't the first time their names had surfaced. One supervisor, watching the video in silence, recognized them instantly. Complaints. Patterns. Incidents that never quite rose high enough to force action. Until now. This time, there was no way to bury it. What began as a routine intimidation attempt had just triggered something far bigger than either officer could imagine. And the consequences were already moving toward them. By the following morning, the incident was no longer isolated. What Judge Carana had captured wasn't just inappropriate behavior, it was evidence. Clear, uninterrupted, and damning. The kind of evidence that doesn't rely on interpretation or testimony. It spoke for itself. Federal investigators began by doing something simple. They listened. Every word, every pause, every shift in tone. The casual threats. The refusal to identify themselves. The repeated attempts to force compliance without cause. And the moment where the justification fell away completely, replaced by something far uglier. As they reviewed the footage, names started appearing in internal databases. Not new ones. Familiar ones. The officers involved had histories. Not official disciplinary actions, but patterns. Complaints that never went anywhere. Reports marked unfounded. Incidents dismissed for lack of evidence. Allegations that, standing alone, were easy to ignore. Together, they told a different story. One supervisor came forward quietly. He had been documenting concerns for months, waiting for something concrete, waiting for proof that couldn't be brushed aside or buried by internal politics. This was it. Investigators began pulling records, dispatch logs, body camera footage from unrelated calls, internal communications. The deeper they went, the clearer the picture became. These officers didn't just overstep once. They targeted certain neighborhoods, certain residents, especially people who stood out, professionals, newcomers, individuals who didn't match what someone else thought belonged. Complaints followed a pattern: vague allegations, no witnesses, no follow-up. Always pressure, always intimidation. Judge Carana's encounter was only different in one key way. She recorded it. As agents widened the scope of their inquiry, they discovered dozens of similar interactions, some captured on partial footage, others corroborated by multiple witnesses who had never felt safe enough to come forward before. Residents described being stopped repeatedly, questioned without reason, asked to prove they lived where they lived, asked why they were around so often. Many had filed complaints. None had gone anywhere. The officers' communications told an even clearer story. Messages exchanged late at night, jokes about cleaning up areas, casual language that reduced entire households to problems that needed managing. What investigators found most alarming wasn't just the behavior, it was how normalized it was. This wasn't a rogue moment. It was routine. As the investigation intensified, financial records began to surface. Unexplained income, payments routed through third parties, connections to private security contracts tied to residential associations. The implications were serious. Officers were being rewarded, financially and professionally, for maintaining an unspoken order, for making certain residents uncomfortable enough to leave, for discouraging others from moving in. And someone higher up knew. Internal oversight had failed. Complaints had been intercepted. Reports rewritten. Evidence quietly discarded. The system had protected them until it couldn't. Judge Carana was kept informed but remained deliberately distant. She didn't interfere. She didn't comment publicly. She let the process do what it was designed to do. Behind closed doors, however, the case was growing rapidly. More names were added. Supervisors, coordinators, civilian collaborators. Each piece of evidence strengthened the next, revealing a network rather than isolated misconduct. What began at her doorway was now a federal civil rights investigation with far-reaching implications. And the officers who once stood so confidently in her doorway were no longer being shielded. They were being watched. This time, by people who didn't look away. The momentum became impossible to stop. As federal agents followed the trail, the investigation moved beyond conduct and into corruption. Financial audits uncovered transactions that couldn't be explained by salaries or overtime. Cash deposits made in patterns designed to avoid scrutiny. Assets acquired quietly, often under names that didn't immediately trace back to the officers themselves. Each discovery tightened the net. Private security firms surfaced as intermediaries, companies hired by residential associations to provide peace of mind. On paper, the services were legitimate. In practice, they translated into targeted enforcement and selective pressure applied to specific residents. The line between law enforcement and private interest had all but vanished. Witnesses began to come forward once subpoenas were issued. Former residents, homeowners, renters, people who had moved away quietly, never realizing their experiences were part of something larger. They told the same story. Unexplained visits, repeated questioning, threats disguised as concern. Some described being stopped so often they altered their routines. Others sold their homes at a loss just to escape the constant scrutiny. A few admitted they had stopped calling police altogether, even when they needed help. The emotional toll was undeniable. Investigators documented each account, matching them against logs and recordings. The overlaps were too consistent to ignore. Dates aligned. Officer names repeated. Language mirrored itself almost word for word. This wasn't coincidence. It was coordination. The scope of the operation expanded further when evidence showed assets seized during questionable encounters had never been properly processed. Property disappeared. Cash never entered official systems. Vehicles changed hands through informal channels. Money that should have been logged had vanished. Follow-up searches uncovered hidden records, spreadsheets tracking encounters, payments, and results. It was bureaucratic in its precision. Cold, calculated, designed to look invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Federal prosecutors began assembling charges methodically. Civil rights violations, conspiracy, abuse of authority, financial crimes layered on top of constitutional ones. Each count carried weight. The officers who once relied on the system to protect them now found that same system documenting their every move. Interviews turned tense. Silence replaced arrogance. Attorneys appeared. The tone had changed completely. Judge Carana, meanwhile, continued her work as usual. She declined interviews. She avoided public statements. Her role had been fulfilled the moment she pressed record and refused to be intimidated. The case no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the evidence. As indictments were prepared, officials realized the damage extended beyond individual careers. Trust had been eroded. Communities had been fractured. Entire neighborhoods had been shaped by fear rather than law. The question was no longer whether charges would be filed. It was how many, and how far up the chain they would go. Because what started with a knock on one apartment door had exposed something far bigger than anyone anticipated. A system that had counted on silence. And lost. When the indictments were finally unsealed, the impact was immediate. Federal agents executed coordinated arrests before dawn, moving quietly through neighborhoods that had once been used as justification for intimidation. The same streets where residents had been told they were being watched, now filled with unmarked vehicles and flashing lights. The officers who had stood confidently in Judge Carana's doorway were taken into custody without ceremony. No warnings. No favors. No special treatment. Court documents outlined the charges in stark detail. Civil rights violations under color of law. Conspiracy to deprive residents of constitutional protections. Financial crimes tied to illicit payments and unreported seizures. Obstruction for those who had helped conceal the conduct. The language was precise and devastating. Evidence spanned years, not months. Patterns, not mistakes. Decisions, not misunderstandings. Prosecutors described an operation that functioned deliberately, reinforced by silence, and protected by complacency. When the officers appeared in court, the contrast was striking. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the posture of authority. They sat quietly beside their attorneys as charges were read aloud. Count after count. Each one tied to documented behavior they could no longer deny. Attempts to minimize their actions failed almost immediately. Recordings contradicted their statements. Financial records dismantled their explanations. Witness testimony filled in every gap. The defense had little room to maneuver. As proceedings continued, additional defendants were named. Supervisors who had dismissed complaints. Individuals who had facilitated payments. Civilian collaborators who had knowingly participated in targeting residents. Careers ended overnight. Resignations followed arrests. Departments issued statements promising reform. Oversight bodies stepped in. Policies were reviewed, not out of choice, but necessity. Sentencing came months later. The judge presiding over the case spoke plainly. Abuse of authority, he said, strikes at the foundation of justice. When those entrusted with power use it to intimidate, exclude, or profit, the damage extends far beyond individual victims. Prison terms were imposed. Long ones. Not symbolic. Not lenient. Years measured in double digits. Careers erased. Pensions forfeited. Reputations permanently destroyed. The message was unmistakable. The system had finally looked at itself and refused to look away. For the victims, restitution followed. Property returned. Funds recovered. Acknowledgement that what they endured was real, unlawful, and wrong. It didn't undo the harm. But it mattered. Judge Carana never sought attention for her role. She continued her work on the bench, carrying forward a reminder she never forgot, that rights only exist when someone insists on them. That night, standing in her doorway, she could have complied. She could have stayed silent. She could have let it pass. Instead, she pressed record. And in doing so, she ended far more than one encounter. She ended an entire operation that had relied on fear. Sometimes, accountability begins with a refusal. And sometimes, that refusal changes everything.